All right, so our goal for this video is to understand how we can compare GDP numbers over time. And to do that, we're going to introduce a really simplified model of calculating GDP. So this is totally hypothetical, but we're just going to assume that we have a country that produces only two products, and we have all the information about the prices of those products and the quantity of the products that is sold in each time period. So then we're going to calculate GDP in each time period, talk about what that means and how we can compare GDP over time. All right, so in this example, we have a country that is producing wheat and milk. We've got 2004, 2005, and 2006. We've got 3 years of data and then price and quantity information for each year. So what we're going to do to calculate GDP is to add up the value, the market value of all of the goods being produced in that country. Right? So this is actually what we call nominal GDP, and we'll talk about the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP after we calculate nominal GDP. So for nominal GDP, what we're going to do is say, well, for 2004, this country produced 100 units of wheat, and the value of that is $1 per unit. And they also produced 100 units of milk, which had a value of $2.50 per unit. So we're using prices here to represent the values so that we can add up production across different industries. And then we can get a number for the total value of everything produced in that year. So that would be $350. So nominal GDP in 2004 was $350. Now we would go ahead and do that same calculation in 2005 and 2006. And we get, again, this number representing the total value of all production in that time period. And I'm going to write all of this out here, because what we want to do now is think about what that means when we compare our GDP numbers over time. All right, so I can see here that my nominal GDP is increasing. Does that mean that total production has increased over time? Well, it's actually pretty unclear just from looking at this total GDP number, because this nominal GDP number reflects both increases in production, in quantity, but it also reflects changes in price, right? Part of the reason this number is going up is because the price of these products has increased over time. So it would be possible to see increasing nominal GDP even if production had stayed the same or decreased simply due to increases in price. So we don't use nominal GDP to compare value of production over time or the total level of production over time. What we need to do is to look at production levels holding constant prices. So that's what we're going to do when we calculate real GDP. Let me just move this over here so I have some more space. When we calculate real GDP, we're going to only use changes in production, holding constant the price level. And we'll do that by setting a base year and then only using prices from the base year to calculate real GDP. So in this example, we're going to use 2004 as the base year. I will always tell you what the base year is, and it's usually the first year. It's basically always the first year of data. So here, 2004 is our base year. We want to go through and recalculate the value of production using only prices from 2004. So you'll notice that in 2004, real GDP and nominal GDP are going to be the same, right? Because in both cases, we're using prices from 2004. that will always be true in every problem. Real GDP and nominal GDP will be the same in the base year. In the other years, though, we're going to get a different answer, right? So here I want to use production from 2005, but prices from 2004. So I've got 120 times $1 plus 100 times 250, and here I get $370 instead of the $600 I got for nominal GDP. So you can see that a lot of the increase, in GDP from 2004 to 2005, a lot of that increase in nominal GDP was just due to the increase in prices. All right, and then for 2006, we'll do the same thing. We'll use the quantities from 2006 and the prices from 2004 from the base year. And we get 400. So by just holding prices constant and only looking at changes in production over time, now we can understand if the economy is growing or shrinking in terms of how much is being produced. So that's what we're trying to measure when we look at GDP, and the growth rate of GDP, is it growing or shrinking, tells me something very important about what's happening in the economy. I would say that the growth rate of real GDP is probably the most important macroeconomic indicator, because this is how we define recession and expansion. So when someone says, we're going to have a recession, or will there be a recession? Recession means in economics something very, very specific. Definition of a recession is at least 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. So a lot of people right now are wondering, with the coronavirus pandemic, if we're going to have a recession. And it's actually a little bit too early to say that. We certainly have an economic contraction, a shrinking of GDP. Whether or not that will last for at least 2 quarters, first quarter, presumably we won't get those numbers until April, but also the second quarter is yet to be seen. I think that most people think that there will be a recession here, but like I said, we won't know until we get the GDP numbers for both the first and second, third, perhaps third quarter of 2020. All right, so let's go ahead and calculate the growth rate of real GDP in this example. You'll remember back to when we were calculating elasticity that we used our new minus old over old formula to calculate percent changes, and we're going to do the same thing here. Now, when you're calculating growth rates in non-consecutive time periods, there is a much more complicated formula that you would need to use. I am not going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you to only calculate growth rates in consecutive time periods. So you can always use this new minus old over old formula to calculate your growth rates. All right, so all we need to do here is to calculate the growth rate between 2004 and 2005 is to do new minus old over old for our real GDP calculation. And when you plug that into your calculator, it's going to give you 0.057, which is a growth rate of 5.7%. Now, if you want to write that as a decimal, that's fine. If you want to write that as a percent, that's great. But just remember how to convert between decimals and percentages. All right, and then from 2005 to 2006, we're going to do 400 minus 370 all over 370, and that would give you 0.81. Okay, 8.1%. All right, good. So this is really the end of what we're doing for production. Okay, we've talked about aggregate production. Why do we care about aggregate production? We talked about using the expenditures method, what gets included in our GDP calculations and what doesn't get included in our GDP calculations. Then we talked about the difference between nominal and real GDP, calculating the GDP, the growth rate of real GDP, and how that's used to define recession and expansion. So the next topic we're going to talk about is changes in aggregate price level. I'll see you in the next video to get that started.